Andrew Young is the Knowledge Director at the Govlab. He directed a global assessment of the impact of open government data and created a methodology for leveraging corporate data to benefit the public good, topics that we can still learn a lot about as well in Switzerland. So we're very excited about that. And thank you, Andrew, for being here and sharing your insights. I will stop my screen share and let you take over. Great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks so much, everyone, for having me. Delighted to be here, and I will try to stick to the 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation so that we have some time for Q&A as well. So again, I'm Andrew Young. I'm the Knowledge Director at the Govlab, and one of our major initiatives these days is something called the Open Data Policy Lab, where we focus on, among other things, an emerging concept that we refer to as the third wave of open data. So this presentation will focus on what we mean by the third wave and how institutions across sectors and across regions can kind of harness the value of that third wave approach to open data to create both institutional or business value as well as public value. Slides will advance. Great. So as I think everyone on this call is familiar with and recognizes, many of the challenges that exist in society that could potentially be addressed through better access to analysis of and use of data go unsolved in many cases because of data asymmetries. The right data is being held by a certain group and the type of people working in the public interest who could harness that value of the data, of those data assets, and use them to create some kind of new public value. So much of our work, and really I would argue the open data space in general terms, is focused on how do you address these data asymmetries. And one of the ways that we tend to think about it is something that we think of as data collaboratives, or in this case, community data collaboratives. How do you build those partnerships where you're matching the supply of data that exists in society with the demand for it among those who could potentially use it to create some kind of public value. So addressing those data asymmetries through a new mode of data collaboration. As I mentioned, this is really coming from a lot of our work in the Open Data Policy Lab. And what I will discuss here in terms of the third wave of open data stems from a series that we hosted last summer, something that we called the Summer of Open Data. A dozen panels with, I think, 50 different experts from across the open data ecosystem from around the world, really reflecting on what is the current state of play in the open data space and how can we make more progress in leveraging both open government data, but also private sector data or data from the civil sector as well to better address certain kinds of public problems. And as I mentioned, we're in this kind of data, the data era, as some like to call it, but much of that data is not being shared with the right people who could kind of take advantage of it and create this new public value and new public good. And what we think of in the third wave is that we've made some progress really building on earlier waves of open data that I'll discuss more in a moment, and recognizing where some of the gaps in previous practice was, and new opportunities to center certain issues around open data or data collaboration that could help to address some of those unmet opportunities from earlier waves. So whenever we discuss an emerging third wave of open data, we start with the idea that there was a first wave that we tend to think of in terms of freedom of information and the like. So having a Freedom of Information Act where there is a focus on creating transparency, a data on request model, and a pool focus model, in the sense that if I'm a journalist, if I am a lawyer, in many cases, those were kind of the two communities, and I knew that government had certain data or information that would be valuable to me, I could go through, in many cases, a somewhat burdensome process to request that data and then pull it back to use it for my purposes. The second wave which really kind of kicked off in the Web 2.0 open source kind of era, was focused less on freedom of information and more around open government data. And it moved away from an exclusive focus on transparency toward one that was focused on both transparency and problem solving. And the kind of dominant approach within the open government data movement was and continues to be, in often cases, an open by default model, and really focused on pushing data out, and information that is held by government is made accessible by default, no questions asked, and just made accessible with the hopes that people outside of government will find novel and impactful uses for that data. And now, as we are seeing in this emerging third wave of open data, rather than a freedom of information or open government data approach, we're seeing more of a focus on reusing public and private data. So moving away from a strictly open by default or data on request model to more of a publish with purpose type of approach toward enabling evidence-based policymaking, innovation and entrepreneurship, and other types of problem solving that really focus on what is the value that this data could create if it were put into the right hands, and let's organize ourselves based on achieving that central purpose. And the focus here has been less on push or pull and more around partnerships, or as I've said, the data collaboration model. And as I mentioned, I want to make sure that I reiterate this. We don't see the third wave as a replacement for the previous waves. This is all building on previous practice and learnings and approaches to, iterate and course opportunities. So, the freedom of information model, the open by default model are still very important and can provide value in certain cases, but we are seeing more and more of this third wave kind of approach. Some of the issues here I've already touched on a bit, including the audience. So we used to see the more expert audience primarily in the freedom of information mode. The kind of emerging civic tech community really got started around the open data movement, the open by default type of movement. Now we see a broader swath of potential reusers of the data that's being made accessible to various kinds of third wave. And the other issues I will touch on in a moment here, as I go through what we see as the 4 central goals of the third wave of open data. So I already touched on publishing with purpose, the fostering partnerships and data collaboration is another key element, really thinking about open data at a subnational level rather than an international or a national level is another really important component of the third wave, as well as a real prioritization and centering of data responsibility and data rights. So just to get into a little bit more detail on each of those, that first goal or tenet of the third wave, as I said, is this understanding what the data user needs and how those needs can be met with data solutions or certain types of data access models. We often focus on the idea that in many cases, the data itself is not necessarily shared with an eventual user, especially whenever that data might have certain sensitivities or might have certain business value in a case where it's coming from the private sector. But really the question often becomes, how do you provide functional access to that data? How do you enable the insights that could be derived from that data to be put into the hands of the people who could use it most effectively? And that might involve sharing aggregated data. That might involve sharing pre-processed analysis of the data with certain organizations or individuals who can make use of it. So really thinking about that functional access to data and organizing those efforts around that central purpose so that there's the publish with purpose model. And here, happy to share some links as well. This is a project that we have been working on at the Govlab for a few years now that's really centered on this publish with purpose type of approach called the 100 Questions, where we sourcing community, what we call bilingual. When we say bilinguals, we mean folks who have both data science expertise as well as domain area expertise. And we have convened several communities of these bilinguals around certain topic areas like migration, like air quality, like disinformation, and asked them to really work together to identify what are the questions that would be most impactful if answered in that domain, and that could be answered through more effective use and analysis of data. So if you go to the 100questions.org, you can see essentially a roadmap for future data collaboration or third wave of open data type of approaches around specific domains and clear opportunities and purposes toward which this work can be organized. The second element, as I mentioned, is really around fostering data collaboration, expanding and matching stakeholders with data holders through new types of partnerships. So we have here our datacollaboratives.org website, which is really the hub for our activities around this work. We've been, as one of the key elements of the data collaboratives program, we have what we call the Data Collaboratives Explorer, which is the largest compilation of these types of cross-sector data partnerships that we've come across, at least. So around 300 or so projects that have been initiated around the world to match that supply and demand, that supply of data with the demand for it, in the interest of creating some new public value. And we're seeing a lot of that data collaboration model really being combined with the open by default and open data model, which they used to feel very much like parallel kind of initiatives. And in this third wave approach, we're seeing more of a focus on addressing problems through different types of approaches to address data asymmetries, rather than thinking, well, there's open government data and then there's private sector data or other uses of data with a collaboration kind of focus. We're seeing more and more of those ideas being brought together to really orient ourselves around it, rather than focusing on where the data happens to come from. The third key goal is, or key issue in the third wave of open data, is a real focus on subnational open data. There are a number of really important and really valuable international institutions and networks and the like that have been advancing open data for quite a while now, and those are obviously very important actors. And we also have seen a lot of activity from national governments to really put a flag down around focusing on open data, building out the open by default type of model. But more and more, we're seeing that some of the most impactful open data work is occurring at the subnational level, where the data sets and the actors who might use those data sets are really closer to the problems and the intended beneficiaries of their work. So we're seeing more and more of that focus on how do we move away from a strictly national level approach to open data to more and more subnational efforts. Here we have an example of some work that we did at Govlab with a number of collaborators to better understand mobility patterns of women and girls in Santiago, Chile, so that urban planners can make more informed decisions and around equitable access to transportation and equitable access to mobility. And to do that, we use various data sources from a subnational kind of focus, including telecom data from Telefonica, so aggregated call detail records, local level open data, open government data, OpenStreetMap data, and other sources to really understand what are those mobility patterns, what are some of the drivers of either more mobility or less mobility, and how can that kind of understanding inform better urban planning and access to transportation in the city. And then finally, the fourth, and in some ways one of the most important elements, is an increased focus on data responsibility and data rights. So in the open by default model, obviously there was some understanding among the key players that privacy and security are major issues, but often the thinking was that the type of data made accessible through open government data portals and the like were not especially sensitive, or did not create much risk, or were unlikely to. But I think that what we're seeing now in this third wave is more of a focus on anticipating those risks that might emerge even from seemingly innocuous kind of data sets, and then developing proactively the type of mechanisms that could help to mitigate those risks. So here we've developed a platform that we call the Data Responsibility Journey, which provides the user with, in many ways, a roadmap or a checklist of different considerations that they might need to have in place as part of a data responsibility strategy. So if you go through this platform, we introduce a number of issues such as the ones on the screen here around things like avoiding monolithic evaluation and whether there have been steps taken to avoid evaluating algorithmic models based on a single accuracy score or metric. That's just one of a few dozen questions there. But the tool really kind of probes the user to think about, have I addressed this? Have I addressed this? So all of the different issues that can emerge over the life cycle of data. You can see here at the top of the screen, we really focus our thinking around data responsibility in terms of what are the risks and opportunities that emerge across the data life cycle? Because we can think about big terms or concepts like privacy, like security, like bias, but ultimately to be really strategic and thoughtful about how we address these risks or potential risks, it's really useful to think about the sequencing of this data lifecycle. So what are the risks and opportunities that emerge at the planning stage of an open data initiative versus at the data collection stage, or whenever it's being processed and stored, when the data is actually being shared, when it's being analyzed, when it's being used? There are different ways that risks and opportunities can emerge across that data life cycle. And ultimately, you can see certain risks that might compound or accumulate as that data life cycle goes through its process. So really thinking about not just risks in broad terms, but really how do risks emerge on that life cycle of data. So whenever, those are kind of the core elements of the third wave of open data, but of course the question is, you create that kind of value from this recognition of what the third wave really entails. And based on, or as a kind of companion to our report that came out of the Summer of Open Data, where we introduced the concepts of the third wave, we've also developed a toolkit that provides some operational guidance on how to capture that institutional and societal value of data reuse. And there are 8 key elements that I will go through very quickly because I know that I am running out of time, but I'll just touch on some of these approaches that we would recommend as valuable in harnessing that third wave. So first, quite a lot of our work at Govlab is premised on this idea that there is in many ways a gap in the human infrastructure around open data and data reuse. And what we would argue is that in many cases, the institutions that create the most value through data collaboration and data reuse have a profession or an individual or a team who is tasked with identifying if, when, and how their data can provide value, identifying opportunities to collaborate with different parties externally and internally to, again, harness that data effectively. So whenever we talk about creating and empowering data stewards, we don't mean data stewards in the sense of data security professionals, which is one of the core kind of definitions of data stewards in many cases. We're thinking about the people who proactively think about how to steward their data in a way that creates institutional value and public value, and defining this new profession and this new type of human infrastructure that can really kind of take the reins of open data and data reuse efforts and help to guide it. And we have a whole lot of guidance there around what some of their key functions would be. And we also convene a network of these data stewards to enable knowledge sharing and develop new understandings of what are good practices in the field of data stewardship and what are some opportunities and needs that the field could help to address. Second is around fostering and distributing institutional data capacity within public, private, civil sector organizations, because what we sometimes see, while it is important to have that data steward who acts as a leader and a convener and a facilitator of this work, it's also important not to have all of the data science know-how residing in one person. Having that as the person off in the corner or the small team off in the corner that does all the data stuff, but then the other folks in the organization have no real understanding or capacity to understand what that data can do and how to create value without introducing new risks. So this doesn't mean that everybody needs to be a data scientist, but having some competency and literacy, which I'll talk about more in a moment as well, is a really important kind of skill to have within institutions that either hold or reuse data in different ways. So distributing that institutional data capacity rather than having it reside in just a small portion of the organization is another important way forward to capture the third wave. Third, we focus a lot on how do you articulate the value of data collaboration and reuse. This is also really important for getting institutional buy-in internally whenever you have, for example, a data steward looking to their superiors to think about how do we build out our data sharing program or a data collaboration program. If you can't articulate that value proposition, that becomes a really hard task to put the type of resources, time, and staffing that goes into doing data collaboration or data reuse well, if there isn't that clear articulation of what the value might be. And building that impact evidence base as a field, we feel is a really important element to help articulate what value has already been delivered through these types of efforts and what value could be delivered if the right actors were brought to the table. So here we have the Data Collaboratives Explorer that I mentioned earlier, as well as we do a lot of work around case studies, more in-depth case studies on some impactful open data projects and what some of those lessons learned in terms of enabling conditions and some of their impacts would be to help inform other work across the field. Next, and I will go through these last ones somewhat quickly. Next, we really of a data intermediary model to help unlock the value of open data and data collaboration. So we talked about matching the supply with the demand. Often there is that intermediary in between that can help to either broker relationships between supply and demand, bring new analytical capacity to the table. We often see cases where the ultimate reuser of the data might be a small organization or one that doesn't have a lot of technical capacity in-house, but working with an intermediary organization that can derive insights and conduct the analysis on data shared by another party can help to, again, move toward that functional access to data and operationalize different data sets that were made accessible even whenever the ultimate user of that data is not a data science focused kind of organization. Fifth, and very importantly, and very much related to the data responsibility issue, is developing a governance framework to organize this work. Because ultimately, the reuse and sharing of data involves a number of different decision points, and in many cases, a number of different actors working effectively together. So what are some of those design principles or key components of a governance framework that can inform decision-making and ensure that all of the work around open data or a data reuse project are really aligned with some core governance principles and ways of operating. So here we have some of the work that we've done on identifying common elements of contracts and memoranda of understanding and data sharing agreements that are driving work in this space. And then the data assembly work, importantly on the left, is something that we've worked on to really build out an understanding of how those involved in open data efforts can align their practices with citizen and public perspectives and gain more of a social license for how they go about doing this work. So as a key component of a governance framework, you could think about how do you engage different members of the public. Here we developed a citizens assembly around data reuse in New York City and tapped into some of the perspectives and insights from a number of different stakeholders and communities, including the general public, but also those who represent civic rights organizations, advocacy groups, data holding institutions, policymakers, and the like, to better understand what do they think is really important to have included in this type of governance framework to act as a bit of a North Star for data handling processes going forward. Then obviously the technical infrastructure for all of this work is really important. And I caught a little bit of the end of the Q&A of the last session and thinking about things like frictionless data, like different ways to build out both the operational kind of mechanisms for data sharing, as well as, especially the privacy preserving or data responsibility components that can ensure that this work is done appropriately and responsibly. We've done some work with colleagues here at NYU at the engineering school around things like differential privacy, like creating nutritional labels for data sets that have outline what types of technical components need to be in place for that data to be handled well and responsibly and safely. Seventh,
if you could come to a close
sure.
very soon, that would be great.
Yep, I am on my next to the last one. So the next one is fostering public data competence. So ultimately, if we're thinking about how do we enable the general public not only to reuse data effectively, but also to have an understanding about what is happening in the data ecosystem around them, especially whenever their data might be used by other parties. How do we ensure that there is that competence and literacy among the public, and conducting some kind of training efforts going forward? It can be really important to ensure that they have a seat at the table in many ways. And then finally, the last element that we focus on quite a bit is this concept of both data provenance. So I mentioned the nutritional labels and having a better understanding of the genesis of certain data sets, but also decision provenance in the sense of how are decisions made, by whom, and what are the processes there, and how do we capture that and articulate that and make it visible to other stakeholders so that we have a better understanding of where those decision points occur, where certain risks might have been introduced, where certain gaps might be in place. So really thinking about not just capturing the history of the data or the process of the data generation and reuse and sharing, but also what is the process for decision making, and how do we make that more accessible to different stakeholders involved in these processes. So that was a whirlwind, but I will leave it there, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Andrew. A lot of inspiration and links to work with after the forum. Are there any questions? There is one in the chat. Who would you say is the main driver of the third wave of open data, of these collaborations?
It's a good question. And I think that one of the reasons that we've really focused on this, building out a network and a concept of data stewardship among different sectors, is that quite often we've seen that historically data collaboratives that bring together public and private, or civil sector and private, or civil sector and government kind of actors tend to be very relationship driven. We see so many examples where a private business collaborated with a government entity because they met at a conference somewhere and had a discussion about what an opportunity to work together might be. And what we're really trying to do in the work around data stewardship is making this type of work more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And that can involve creating more institutional processes and more concrete ways of going about this, so that we aren't so reliant on relationships as the key driver for these types of collaborations.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will take over for the moment. You've mentioned the data responsibility platform that helps to steward data in a responsible way. Is this something that you have to push strongly, or is there an interest and everyone is asking for it and happy that it exists?
Both, I would say. So in a lot of ways, people are eager, and people in general terms, but I think that stakeholders that are involved, data stewards that are involved in enabling this work, are very interested in being responsible. Nobody wants to be the reason that harms fall on certain individuals or institutions because of irresponsible data work. So I think there is very clearly an appetite for this type of data responsibility guidance, and there is interest in in using it. The challenge becomes how much is too much for especially a small entity to actually work with. The very first time we developed the tool, we had our long list of questions of, have you done this? Have you addressed this? Have you ensured that this is in place? And in speaking with some folks from startup businesses that hold data, you could see all of the color leave their face, because they're like, we're a 5-person team. There's no way that we could do this well. So that is kind of a big question, I would say, in the data responsibility space, is how can we determine what's good enough for different types of data, for different types of institutions, for different types of risk? So that's something that, there is that interest, but whenever it comes time to actually act on the guidance and the key kind of best practices in data responsibility, it can become somewhat burdensome. And the real challenge, I think, going forward is, how do we make it less burdensome to be more responsible in data handling?
Thank you very much. If we don't have other questions, I'll just use the time for my questions. And another one that I have, you've mentioned that part of the third wave is to measure the impact and articulate the value. How exactly do you do that? Is that on a qualitative level or as well on a quantitative?
I think that both are really important. A lot of our work has been more qualitative in nature. So we do a lot of detailed case studies on different impactful data projects. We use a framework that focuses on 4 key types of value that open data can create. One being improving governance, so thinking about improved transparency and accountability and the like. The second, around empowering citizens to make better decisions and have more of a certain issues. Third, around creating new economic opportunity and external innovation. And then fourth, addressing various types of big public problems, whether they be crisis response or the like. So using that as a bit of a framework, for our work, we've been able to kind of identify many different impactful projects in a more qualitative way. We also do a series that we call the Govlab Index, which can be pretty valuable in our estimation, which is a compilation of statistics that really the value of different issues, including open data. I can link here in a moment, but having, in some cases, just a proxy numbers and statistics that can speak to the potential value of certain efforts can be really valuable. Always having that, not just the qualitative, but the more quantitative, numerical kind of understanding of value. But I do think that in some cases, we, as a field, in the interest of moving toward more quantitative understanding, we can get into some of the more speculative kind of open data can generate $5 trillion in the next 10 years types of discussion, which I'm not sure how much value that has in practice. I think it's useful to have those kind of big, broad numbers to speak to the value, but I'm not sure how kind of operationally useful that type of big estimate would be.
Thank you very much. Another question from Francesca: empowerment of citizens. When the primary source of data are individuals, geo-tracking, etc., do you think people need more incentives, and if yes, what kind, financial and or other, to share their data?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of building a social license. Because I think at this point, a lot of that type of work, especially when we're talking about geo-tracking or mobility data, there isn't always a clear understanding of how that data is being generated, who collects it, who it's being shared with, and for what purposes. So I think that first and foremost, we need to get to a point where there is an understanding of what the state of play is. And then I think it's a challenging kind of series of next steps. I don't think that there's one easy fix to this where we say you get X number of dollars per organization that tracks your data. I think that gets into many kind of tricky and potentially unethical kind of issues whenever we talk about payment for personal data. But I think that what we can do, and there might be a way to do that well, but I think a lot of the discussion at this point makes me a little bit nervous about what some of the implications would be of paying folks for their data. But I think that what we need to do is move toward more of a societal understanding of what is and is not appropriate, and then organizing ourselves around what the public deems to be most valuable and important. So the data assembly that I spoke about, we didn't just focus on the privacy issues or just the data responsibility issues. One of the key things that we asked folks was, is this example that we give a useful use of data? Is this a valuable and worthwhile undertaking? And getting a better sense of what people deem to be not just appropriate, but what they deem to be worthwhile and worth all of the efforts and potential introduction of new risks, I think is a really important piece of work that hasn't been done effectively to date. So I think those are kind of two core elements of building out this social license, which, as you said, kind of is very much tied in with the empowerment of citizens and becomes especially tricky when we're talking about geo-tracking and things that are so place-based or oriented around someone's physical body.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspective. Now, if we don't yet, we do have one more question. I would say the last one. What is your take on Kaggle? It brings also collaborations on data together by hosting competitions, but also by sharing data. Do you think the third wave is bringing open data closer to the Kaggle approach? Do I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, yes, and I think the answer is yes. That's one of the models that we see, kind of operational models for this third wave approach or for a data collaborative approach, is a prize-backed model. So having those, speaking of incentives, an incentive to do this work and to work toward creating new public value from certain data sets that in many cases might go beyond the actual mandate or specific kind of job function or institutional mission of an organization. Having some kind of incentive prize is something that can be really valuable. So I do think that Kaggle is a really interesting model, and I think that it is so uniquely focused on that first tenet that I spoke about, which is publishing with purpose. So organizing yourself around one central goal and then having all of the data activities really moving toward achieving that goal, rather than, well, we have this data set at hand, maybe we can do something interesting with it, which I think is not always the case, but can be that kind of not purpose-driven type of approach. But I think that Kaggle is a great example of a more incentive-based and purpose-oriented type of data reuse.